Well, in 1942, I was just finished my second year at Guelph at the Ontario Agricultural College, and by that time the war had been going for 3 years, I guess, and Pat Bay was that summer I worked at Pat Bay for money, and in that we were building hangars out there at the time for the establishment of the RCIF there, the OTU, Operational Training Unit, OTU. And so we that summer I was doing that work, but I guess the matter of the country being at war, and my dad had been in the service, and my uncle and my grandfather and so on, and besides that, I wasn't too anxious to get back to school again. I wasn't enjoying it that much, but so I decided to go downtown and see what was available. And before I knew it, I'd signed up. But first of all, I went down to Victoria. In the Belmont building was the Navy. And because of my interest in boats and water and stuff around here, I thought, well, I'll go and join the Navy. But went in there, and the only categories or work that was available in the Navy was stokers. And to me, stokers meant shoveling coal. It actually means an awful lot more than that, but in my limited mind, that didn't sound very interesting to do the rest of the war, just shoveling coal in a ship. So I went across the road, across the other side of Government Street, over the Belmont building where the RCAF were recruiting. And over there I said, I looked at things and I said, I want to be a pilot. Okay. And they checked into my credentials and so on. They said, yeah, probably all right there. So I joined up in the middle, sort of in July of that year, I asked if I could not be reporting until September. Well, that's what happened, and it was about the middle of September. I reported to Edmonton, and that's as an aside to this story. Through a lady friend of mine in Victoria, she said, "Oh, I know a friend of mine is going the same trip as you are, same time, and he has to report. He's going in the Air Force. You'll have to meet him and go together." Well, that sounds good. So and it happened to be Hugh Ramsey of now Ramsey Machine Works. Anyway, that was Hugh and I left from CPR docks in Victoria after being introduced. We left together and head off for Edmonton. That's where we were for we were there, I guess, a month during Manning Depot, where we learned the ins and outs of marching and so on. So in Edmonton, I was initiated into the mysteries of Army life. In this case, it was Air Force. There was a strict disciplinarian there. He was an ex-Mountie. He was about 6'10", or it seemed to me anyway, with a voice to match, and he was to be looked at and reported to. There was it just happened that we were there a couple of weeks, and this was in September, the latter part of September, and there was a huge snowstorm, and there were 2 feet of snow, and the barracks had to be, well, everybody was shut down there in barracks, and there was nobody going off the base at all. Howsoever, we did get posted at that shortly after that to the number 7 SFTS Service Flying Training School at Saskatoon, and they called that for tarmac duty. Actually, it was a holding tank for guys that because there wasn't room in the courses ahead of us that we had to take. We just had to wait until our turn came, and then we were there. And that was in the middle of the winter, January, February. It was March before we got back down to Regina. But while we were in Saskatoon, it was the coldest I've ever felt. It was coldest winter I've ever felt. At 52 below one night and 58 below another night. Both those nights, we had to take turn at guard duty, and the guard duty was up in these towers. You climbed up about 20 feet up a ladder, you know, in these towers, and with a heater in front of you and a heater behind you, and sitting there in a greatcoat with as many other clothing that you could handle, put on, and a rifle across your lap. You just sat there for, I don't know, 8 or 10 hours or whatever the shift was. Seemed to be half the night. And all you were watching for were really the guys that were coming in late over the fence, which seemed to be rather futile effort in the Great War that was going on overseas, and guys getting killed over there. And anyway, it was all in our training. And we were there at that base till March, and then we went down to serious schoolwork down at in Regina to an ITS, Initial Training School, where we learned the ins and outs of flying, and it was basically a ground school. And we graduated. Let's see. We graduated from there and went to actual flying school in Fort William, which was an elementary flying training school, EFTS, and that's where I got my first real flight training. Meanwhile, back at Saskatoon, the first time I'd ever been up in an airplane was there. And we would go down to the flight office where the instructors were going out and testing aircraft and so on. And so you'd try to bum a ride on with one of these testing of the aircraft and so on. And so I went up for 3 or 4 times with those guys just to get the feel of flying. While we were at Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay, but when we were at Fort William, we had training in a link trainer, which is most people know what the link trainer is. It's just a little cubby hole, but it's a little cabin that's flexible in all directions and has all the instrument panel that you'd have in the aircraft and so on, and they put you through a training, and you'd do these trips. Well, I was in the link trainer and had all that experience, and so after that bit of experience, they this particular time took you up in the aircraft, and then they put a hood over your not exactly overhead, but a hood around you, so all you can see is the panel, instrument panel, but you can't see anything else in the aircraft. And he's behind you in the other cockpit back there, and you have this on. He says, "Okay, now take over." and he tells you to go here, and you go there, and you go up, and you go down, and you go around, and after half an hour of that, and I did all right on that, but he said, you can take the hood off now. So you take it off, wonder where you are. I was about 10 feet over Lake Superior. Oh. And I'm sure the wheels must have been 8 feet down. So they must have been about 2 feet off the water, I don't know. But it sure gave me a scare. Because he knew all the time he'd been doing this to other guys, I guess, but I'd never heard of it. But we came right down to the surface of Lake Superior, and we were skimming along, and I expected to be up 4,000 feet in the air. So that was a heart-pounding experience that one reason I remember that is that I wrote home about it, and I still have that letter kicking around somewhere. So that was about all there. Then at Portage Prairie, we were flying in Anson's, and that's a 2-engine aircraft flown by a pilot. But we weren't. All we were was doing there was passengers, and we did navigational exercises at a little desk, and we did some aerial photography work there too. And that carried on for 5 months, and then we were out of there, and that's when I graduated from a AC2 aircraftsman second class to a sergeant. Got my wings, and it wasn't long after that. I think within a couple of weeks of that, I got my commission. That depended on the marks you got, and yeah, well, one thing and another, you get your commission along with at least half the course, I guess, got their commissions. So I was a pilot officer by that time, sent home on a I got sent home and with a month's leave before we being posted overseas, and at that point that was a good long rest back here. And all this time Hugh Ramsey had been with me. He was training as a pilot too in Fort William, and that's where we met Ella, his wife, and they were married in due course before he got out of the Air Force. But she was from Fort William there too. And so it was a month here on leave, and on the way down to Halifax, posted overseas, they changed the embarkation depot from Halifax, where you embarked onto these cruise ships that were to take you overseas, the troop ships. And I got down as far as Lachine, and they took us all off the train and said that there's been a change in plans, and we're sending you on another month's leave with pay while we move the embarkation depot from Halifax to Lachine. So at that point I didn't want to come back home because I'd said goodbye, and I was with my friend Jim Eddy, who was my co-partner during the navigation training. And Jim's still alive. He's in a hospital situation in Toronto. Maybe talk more about Jim later on. So so we didn't want to come home. So Jim and I, Jim had his skis, but I borrowed a pair of skis from, and we went skiing for a couple of weeks up into into the Laurentians out of Montreal up to Mount Tremblant. And that was, but actually, what we did, we started off at the bottom of the whole valley there. Started off at the bottom and spent a whole week just going from one place to another, one little village to another, with a small pack on our back, and for $1 a night, we had bed and breakfast, which was pretty good for servicemen. And well, so all we had was skis and a small backpack, and we just kept going. And oh, that was a great excursion, a great vacation there, so to speak, up in the snows. And this was February 1943 by that time, and all in this, all for the sake of the war effort, of course. Finally, by March, we got sent down to Halifax and on board ship, and went over on the ship, the Ile de France, and landed over in England 5 days later in Bournemouth. No, we landed in Liverpool, went by train down to Bournemouth, and we stayed there for some more, a week or two for postings. So on to elementary flying training school, and there they had the aircraft there were Tiger Moths, which is the biplane, a two-winged plane that the leftovers, I think, from the First World War. But there was a good training aircraft, and they were reasonably safe. There were a few casualties, though, with guys that had problems, but we had a good more ground school there, and some air. We were by the time we got 8 hours in the air with an instructor, I was able to have my solo flight, which was a great turning point in my career of not going anywhere, because later on, by the time I had 32 hours in, I was up with the instructor, and he put me through my paces in forced landing procedures. And so apparently I didn't do so well on that. They had told us how to do it and so on. That's where you go to about 4,000, 4,500 feet, and then he says, or then he cuts the engine, and you're on your own, and you go into a forced landing procedure. And what you do on the way down is you drop a couple of thousand feet. You're just gliding down, and you pick out a spot on the Earth's surface there that looks like a good place to land, with no motor or anything going. So, but 2,000 feet down, you're supposed to fire up the engine again, so that when you do get down at the ground area, it has been noted that sometimes the engine doesn't catch and fire up again. So at that, if that happens, well, then you crash. So the idea is just to make sure the engine was going okay halfway down. Then by the time you get down there, you don't really land, but you come mighty close to the ground. And this particular time, I guess they'd done this before, but it was at a golf course, and you'd come down and run along over top of the fairways. The fairways are just a matter of hills with the grass cut, but the hills ups and downs. It's a terrible place to try to land in the wind or anything else. And anyway, at the end of all that, we got back down. The instructor walking back to the hangar, and he says, "Well, I'm going to have to tell you that you won't be going any further in your flying training. Well, Um, I don't remember now whether he gave me any reasons for stopping me at that point, but he said it was over my forced landing procedures. Okay, well that was pretty earth-shattering to me, but life went on, and I got posted over to actually to Brandon. Arrived there about 2 o'clock in the morning, and got taken off by a vehicle over to Portage la Prairie. And I spent 5 months there training as a navigator. I ended up overseas in March of 1943. Pardon me, 1944. Because it had taken most of that year of 1943 in the training here in Canada. One thing about going over in the ship was that it wasn't stormy sea, but there was always the roll of the ship, and I can remember to this day they had over the tannoy, what they call the tannoy on the ship, but it's the public address system, but in England it's called the tannoy. The public address system was playing classical music, and Clair de Lune was their favorite. And I still, to this day, remember whenever I hear Clair de Lune, I just feel the roll of that ship as we going across the ocean and back and forth and back and forth. And I never did get a real bad headache or get seasick, but there was a sort of feeling in your body and in your throat that you wish you were there and nowhere or else back home. Anyway, we got over it. It was about 5 days. Interesting, when we left the wharf in March in Halifax, there was a lot of ice and snow around, left over from the winter. We left in the evening, and by the morning, it was just the balmy, most warm air, and that's where you go from the shore air that's along the coast there. You go out, and overnight you get out into the Gulf Stream. I won't take you through all the bases in England that we were at, but I arrived on our squadron base in October of 1944. And after a lot of training and conversion from twin-engine bombers to the Halifax Mark 7, which was a 4-engine bomber, big Bristol engines on it. I think there were 1,500 horsepower each. Anyway, it was just a great aircraft to fly, and we never did get converted over to Lancasters, which was the next step that we were to go to in improving the aircraft that were going on these missions. Or I should say, we shouldn't say missions, because I've been brought up on that particular terminology and told that in no uncertain terms that these were operations. Only the U.S. guys went on missions, so I've never to use the missions again. So, so my first operation was, I should tell you about how I found the crew. The crew for this Halifax bomber is, there's a number of 7. There's the pilot, 2 gunners, that is the mid-upper and the rear gunner. There's 3. The pilot there's an engineer up there with him to assist him in takeoffs and landings and so on, and just to generally look after all the equipment associated. A wireless air gunner, who was the radio man, and to be a gunner if something happened to either the other 2. and there was a bomb aimer who was up in the nose of the aircraft where I was principally. I might say how we got together. From my experience back at flying training school, I'd met a fellow by the name of Paul Rigetti, and well, he and I had followed right through, I guess, from ITS, and we both washed out at the same time. I went to navigation school, he went to bombing gunnery school, and our courses must have more or less ended about the same time, because we ended up over in England, in Bournemouth, and up in Wellsbourne, Mountford, I think it was, that we crewed up. We ended up there together. So what they did in crewing up and gathering these 7 people together was they put us in a room, and everybody was in the room except the pilots. I mean, all the other crew categories. And there across the room was this Paul Rigetti, and I hadn't seen him for months. And he was a bomb aimer and I was a navigator, so I was a little taller than than a lot of the crew members, and I could see Paul, and so we were delighted to join forces, and we started looking around for others, and finally we got just by asking, and I guess that was about it. To just talking around, we just in a few minutes we found our 2 gunners, Army Armstrong, Graham Armstrong, and Pete Petaski. I just found out there about a month ago that Pete's now passed on, but I found out that his name was Adam, Adam Petaski, but he was always known to us as Pete. That was the 2 gunners, and then Frank Dupuy, he came along as was there as a wireless air gunner. But our pilot Bill Miller, I was able to spot him. All the pilots seemed to come in one bunch from another room, and I spotted him, and I saw he had two. He was a flight lieutenant, and so we asked him if he would be our pilot, and that was it. And so we pretty well had our crew there. It was, and we were a great crew, and we all had confidence in each other, and life went on from there.
Was that unusual for the crews to be put together by the crew themselves?
Yeah, that was the usual thing.
That was the usual thing?
Yeah. Therefore, I think it was a good idea too, because if you say, well, you have to fly with this guy, or if you're all 7 come from different directions and nobody knows anybody, and that's not the best scenario as far as I'm concerned. It was never explained to me. I don't think it was ever explained to me why it was done that way, but I can see that was the best way to do it. Just put you in a big huddle, big pool, and let you figure it out for yourself. I don't know what happened. The last guys in the room that weren't crewed up, and what happened to them. But as far as we were concerned, we were quite happy to 2 or 3 of us knew each other and went on from there. Yeah. Most of our, I would say about at least 2/3, maybe 3/4 of our trips were at night. And the other, at the end of the war, when there was minimal fighter planes around, that we would be safe enough in flying in the daytime, so we would go and sometimes seeing other Americans. They had the day shift, and we had the night shift, and sometimes we'd see the Americans on the day shift. That was more fun experience doing all these trips, some of these trips in the daylight, because you could see some more of the action around. Otherwise, it should be said that at night there was no lights, no running lights on the aircraft, and the only light in the aircraft was, besides, I guess, on the pilot's dashboard, was on my desk, and I was all totally screened off so that no light could get out, which that was okay with me. I was also sitting right over top of the escape hatch, which gave me a little bit more assurance that maybe if I had to, I could get out in a hurry. As I say, well, no, I haven't said it yet, but we did 28 trips, and most of these were at night, though. Flying at night is quite an experience in that most of these raids were involved anywhere from 200 or 300 planes to 1,000. And when you were there, you didn't see any of these planes around you. You'd come in to a target, and the assigned target of Cologne or Berlin or something like that, and you'd be at a certain level which you had to be at because they came in on waves, and you had a certain time to be there, which was most important. So you had a certain level, and certain time to be there, and that's why all watches are synchronated back at the briefing just before you take off, so that everybody's on the same schedule. Another thing was that, as I said, you don't see anything around you, but you know somebody was close by because all of a sudden you'd feel a bump, an air bump, and that would indicate that you've passed through the airstream of some aircraft who's just been ahead of you somewheres. Another technical point here too is if I was 2 minutes ahead of time, for instance, and I had to lose 2 minutes to get on an accurate time on my time ETA sort of thing, estimated time of arrival, I would go off to the right for 2 minutes at a 45-degree angle for 2 minutes, and then I'd correct that, but go back 90 degrees back to get back on course again for 2 minutes, and that forming an equilateral triangle, hopefully, you would lose 2 minutes, and that's where you'd run into these bumps in the middle of the night when you were crossing over the airstream of these other guys who you never saw, but you're crossing in front of them. It's something like experience on the highways nowadays, and you're trying to get across, and sort of fun, but escaped all those things. In between these flights, when we were called out to drop the bombs, in between we'd be assigned to do certain training excursions, and they were always at night, and so this particular night we were assigned to go and quote unquote bomb Bristol, England, and we had the track was all laid out for us, and so it was my job as a navigator to get us all around back on time and all that stuff. Okay, so I gave them, so we did our turning points and so on, and came in a lined up with Bristol to drop the bombs, sort of thing. We didn't have any bombs on board, but we had to go through the motions, and it was all checked out after we got back. So I gave them, and then we were at about 19,000 feet. You put on oxygen when you're at about 10,000 feet. That is, you put the mask on, and or have the mask on from that point on, because you're going up. And in the navigator's case, the oxygen mask tube plugs into the wall behind you, because I'm sitting sideways to the motion, to the direction of the aircraft. So this is in behind me. At least I thought it was. But somehow or other it got pulled out of the wall, and we went past Bristol. It was a night that was overcast. You couldn't see down through the clouds. Went past Bristol, went 10 minutes past Bristol, and I came to life again, and found out what the problem was. Plugged it back in and told the pilot to do immediate change of course. Gave him another direction so we could get back onto where we were, and anyway, we did that and didn't get any problems between there and home. But the thing is that all these flights like that are the ground crews are all pre-warned that there are aircraft out doing these sort of things at night, and that we have in the aircraft a gadget called an electronic IFF, meaning we were friendly people flying over, and not to be mistaken for Germans coming over. So anyway, we didn't. No harm took place, but I still remember overshooting our target by 10 minutes. And everybody else was just, yeah, when are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? But what had happened was I was unconscious. I'd lost my oxygen. Anyway, that was the only time I guess I pulled a big boo-boo. Could have been worse. Could have been over top of Berlin, I suppose. Well, generally speaking, we had an easy go of it. There was, I think I mentioned in that first flight, we had one hole in the wing, and that would have come from, that was from anti-aircraft guns. Those guns, of course, were all radar controlled, and they were pretty accurate. And the flak situation, it was pretty intense. As well as the searchlights, and you had to be. We had training on avoiding that sort of thing. Back in England, we did training on avoidance.
So when you're in the plane and those bursts are going off around you, is there a feeling, a tangible feeling to the concussions? Is there a concussion that you feel, or what's happening in your seat when that's going on? What's the
with the flak, those are exploding shells in the air, and of course they send out all these bits and pieces all around, and the idea is to break through the gas tanks and create havoc in your aircraft. You'd hear the occasional sound, or feel the thump, the vibration. But generally speaking, it wasn't a rough trip that way, unless you got almost a direct hit, and then you knew you were. But we didn't have anything that close. There was one piece of shrapnel came through the fuselage, and in behind the pilot's head was a 2-inch piece of perspex. And that was a big sheet of protection that he had behind his head. And there was a large piece of metal came through on one of our trips, came through the fuselage, bounced off this piece of perspex and fell to the floor. And I think the engineer, Bill Chubb, I think he has that in his collection of trinkets. But that was a piece of metal that was at least 2 inches long and about 1 inch thick. Yeah, it was kind of scary, especially if it hit anybody. But outside of that, we had very little damage to our aircraft. We were very lucky, very lucky. I was gainfully employed 95% of the trip, if not 100%. We had two radar systems. One was the G-box and the other an H2S system, which was a scanner, a bubble on the bottom of the aircraft, and it involved a scanner which sent out signals to the ground and then received them back up, the signal back up, and you could tell by the signal whether you were over water or roofs of houses or a forest. It was all showed up differently, so it was a great help. It could of course penetrate clouds and that sort of thing. So, but this G-box brought in radio signals which were at cross sections to each other, and you were able to establish your position. But the only opportunity I had of seeing very much was just a few minutes on the run up to the target after I'd given the bomb aimer or the pilot the direction, and then the bomb aimer took over, and I also had given the pilot the turning point right after the target. You always turned. You didn't keep going straight. You immediately turned one direction or the other, and I give that. You always gave that to the pilot in advance, maybe in 10 minutes in advance of the target. So there's that little bit of time in there that you're able to look around if you wanted to, and but in the daylight operations, you had more opportunity. And I had one opportunity of seeing an accident, a terrible thing for the people that were involved, but in the daylight raid that somebody said, somebody's been hit, so close by. And so I jumped to the nearest window that I could look out, and as I pointed out earlier, you come in at different levels and on a certain time now, and you're jockeying around for a position so you're not over top of somebody else and you're not under somebody else when the bombs are going down. But this unfortunate soul was down maybe 300-400 feet lower than we were, going in the same direction, of course, but he got a bomb went through his fuselage and severed the plane. So the tail part was going down like a leaf by itself, and the other part was streaming off and smoke and whatever. And I saw about 3-4 parachutes fellows came out and jumped, but out of the 7, I guess. That's the only, we didn't see very much as navigators. We didn't see much of what was going on, which was good, because it kept your mind on your work and not worrying about things like a tail gunner, where he's always worrying about, he's always on the lookout and looking around for this, that, and the other. We were in, they were all marked with 3 letters with a dash, and then the particular letter of the aircraft. The first 3 letters would be your squadron, but then the other would be the aircraft. And we were in Q for Queenie, and for about the first 8 or 10 trips that we were on, and we got quite attached to it, and we knew it was a reliable aircraft, and so on. And then, but other basically, you're just assigned to an aircraft that was not U.S., that is unserviceable. an aircraft that was ready to go. So, but towards, and then Queenie, she, I don't know where it went, but we were assigned for a number of trips to other aircraft. And then I see by my logbook that Queenie came back again, but it was a different aircraft with the same lettering, same last letter. But yeah, it's nice to have been able to fly in one aircraft that you sort of felt like more at home in it. I just one of our rear gunner, Pete. He said he fired off 600 rounds. He wasn't sure about this aircraft, but he fired off 600 rounds anyway, just to make sure that this wasn't a shadow only, that it was a real thing. When we were sent on a trip over to the Kiel Canal, which is over basically the boundary between Denmark and Germany, and to wreak some havoc there in the canal. We did that in 2 trips actually. The first trip, we lost one engine on the way over. It lost the use of it. And so we turned around, came home, dumped the bombs in the ocean before we came over land, and we came back in 3 engines anyway. Each one of those engines though is 1,600 horsepower, so we still had whatever that comes to, 4,000 or 5,000 horsepower to get us home. But that was fine. I think Bill got a decoration for that maneuver, and I think it happened about the same time as our mid-upper gunner. He was jumping off one of the trucks that took us out to the dispersal area where our aircraft would be, and jumping out of the truck, his ring finger caught on a bolt protruding out from holding up the framework for the canvas over the back. Anyway, it ripped his finger off. And there was no blood. I can see it now. It was just white as white. And here his finger was lying down on the tarmac. And to make a long story short, he had to go to the hospital, of course, picked up the rest of the finger and they tried to put it back on in the hospital, but it didn't take. So he ended up with half a finger. The bones were there, but and it grew skin over it. But he only had use for half of the finger. But he was a good guy, good kid. He's only in I guess he was 20, 21. So we had to fill in with somebody else. So the quick request went out for another guy to come in, because the old engines were running by this time. We had to keep in line, and we had to, take off when our turn came. And we were about the second in line before the taking off. There's one aircraft in front of us, and a Jeep came roaring out with this guy that we had to take aboard. He was the gunner for the trip, and he sat in the top of the inside the top of the aircraft, manning the gun up there. And it's all kind of, especially to the pilot, it's kind of shaking up, and it's full of stress and stuff. And anyway, we had a good pilot and came through that all right. And the Army, he eventually joined us later on, but minus half a finger. Meeting Jesse was through a blind date, and I had through my pilot, he invited me on a blind date. He had been going out with taking his cousin on dates there in York And while his cousin, she had a friend, and Bill had been in the had occasionally taken his cousin out on a date. So we her name was Miller also, and she was a Dusty Miller, which a lot of the Millers were called in those days. And Dusty Miller had a friend which she brought along, providing Bill could find somebody to fill in the foursome. So that was fine. And I found we met in the Station Hotel, I think they called it, Station Hotel there on the main line of the railway up into Scotland. I can remember vividly the time came where Dusty and her friend, she was introduced to me as Jessie MacArthur, and that we would have some fun that night, and we would get to know each other. But Dusty, she was a little apprehensive about, she wanted Jessie to make a good impression on this young fellow that Bill was bringing along. And anyway, the whole evening turned out to be great, and so there were many meetings again afterwards. We liked dancing, and we just had a generally good time, and that lasted for some time there through the years, or through the months actually, because this was at about January or February of 1944. This particular happening happened, and the war went on. I kept doing my trips. Jessie was a teletype operator in 6 Group Bomber Command headquarters, Canadian RCAF headquarters, in an adjacent town or area, closest to Knaresborough, Yorkshire. But the Bomber Command had taken over a castle there, and from an FC sympathizer, and the government, in their wisdom, took his residence away from him. He and his wife moved out to the so-called carriage house out at the entrance of the property, and spent the rest of the war there. And anyway, in the meantime, the Canadians moved in, and they had the use of the castle, boarded everything up in there, and everything was tickety-boo by the time they moved out, I guess. Hope it was. Good neighbors. Good neighbor policy, I guess. Anyway, Jessie was in that situation where she was an operator of these teletype, and the teletype machine was really the precursor of the computer, and is another way of emailing information through electronic mail to the other stations and to their headquarters and so on. And they always knew, the gals operating these teletype machines, they knew, sworn to secrecy of the messages going and coming, but they knew where the ops were on that night, and who was out, and who the crews were, and all this stuff. And, it was quite involved that way, because some of the girls that were in there, these were all women's division, RCAF, some of the girls in there had husbands, because they were over there for a year or two. They got married, and they had husbands that were doing ops at the time. And so they were always interested to see whether they came home safely or not. During the operations of, there was 55,000 Canadians were lost in the operation of in the war operations that would be from the 6 years up until 1945. So that's basically, and then we didn't get married over in England though. I came home volunteering for the Pacific in 1945 in June, and got a quick trip home to re-muster and recrew and get ready for the Pacific. And so I was, and then while we were waiting to do that, back in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the 2 atomic bombs were dropped over in Japan, and that created the end of the war for the Japanese, and I was sent home, and the rest of us, we got out. I was out in September of that year of 1945, which was a quick release because some of them had to wait for some months, a good part of a year before they got out. We corresponded during the months following, and Jesse didn't get back home till about Christmas time. And during this course of time we corresponded, and I invited her to come out here in May of the following year, which she seemed to enjoy accepting, and so she came out and we stayed with the mom and dad. I was still living at home too, so we were all happy family in the house. I was still on the farm, at the experimental farm in Sydney, Sanderson. And so it was at that time that we became engaged, and Jesse went back home to Kitchener, and we agreed that we would get married back there in Kitchener, and that's basically what happened in the Presbyterian Church. Mom and Dad were very pleased with the idea, and so were her folks. So I went back there in remember my dates. We were married in September 7th, and 1945, and that was in the Presbyterian Church in Kitchener, Ontario. Our honeymoon, maybe I could tell you about our honeymoon, the parts that I can tell you
This
about.
is a family show.
The family show. Yes. But of course I had to go back down there, and that I went down with Hugh and Ella Ramsey, who they had Ella came from Thunder Bay, or Fort William actually, in those days, from Fort William, Ontario. So they decided they'd go back to Fort William. I'd get a ride almost all the way back to Ontario anyway, and then go by bus down to Kitchener. And that's what happened. I got off at Duluth, Minnesota, and went down to I think we got off at Galt, and Father MacArthur, James MacArthur, he came over and picked me up and took me back there, and so we were married there in a few days' time. Her father was a general handyman, he was chauffeur and all sorts of other things for Thomas Seagram, who was of the Seagram distillery family, and their headquarters were in Kitchener also, and so he was able to drive us around. And in our honeymoon, we had the use of their cottage up at Penetang Machine, up at Penetang, where which was a house just across the road from the big Seagram mansion or house, which was on the lake, and very nice, quiet place. It was a great place to have. And just to wind things up at this stage, in order to get back, we had agreed to live back here on the west coast, and here in Victoria area, and so to get back here, we went by train up to Fort William, where Hugh and Ella were still there, and we went back to Victoria by car in a short time, in a few days. The borrowed car was an opera coupe. That is, it had sort of, I guess you'd explain it as jump seats in the back. It's almost like the pickup trucks nowadays, where they rather cramped quarters. But anyway, that's the way we rode across North America. Back home, in the back of this car, which was only a very confined quarters, but we didn't seem to mind it at that stage of life, and so we got home safely, and we thank Hugh and Ella very much for that ride all the way back through the country. We took number 2 highway pretty well, if I remember rightly, number 2 highway all the way through from Duluth through to the west coast here. So that's about the story of when, at the time when we were married, and before and after. Period. Well, through my working years, I've always had outdoor work, either through the greenhouse or working for the Parks Department of the Saanich, or working with the forestry people, Canada Forestry Lab there in Burnside. All my jobs seem to be on the outside work mode, and it was a good life. I enjoyed it at all times, but if you're out there to make money, that isn't the way to go. But money isn't everything in life, so I found and realized later. So and all the looking back on it now with my health the way it is, it's rather good. At my age, I'm quite happy with the way things are going. But I think it's been because of the outdoor activities I've been able to carry on through all those years, since all the working years. The children grew up in that with that atmosphere around them. They were all expected to work around the house and work outside, and I always had chores and that sort of thing for them to do outside. So it's important that the young people nowadays learn the work ethic. And Dennis, our oldest son, he's had a business for over 30 years. We're hiring and firing people that really, it was quite often it would be their first job in their life. and he could tell right off whether they knew how to work or whether they had a long ways to go. And so it was the ones that knew how to work were the ones that hung on to the jobs, and that's you have to want to work, sort of thing, and like it. If you don't like the work, well, then move on to a job that you do like. But that has been a good one of the main reasons that I am in the health that I am in right now. Another is that the church that I belong to now, I've had now for 51, 52 years since I joined the church, but there's a health code there that's been recognized and throughout the world as very important, and that is no alcohol and no coffee, meaning caffeine and that sort of thing, but good healthy attitude towards keeping your body health and that sort of thing. Yes, so looking back over it, haven't made much money as a nest egg, but I have the health that in its place, I guess. That's one way of looking at it. I'm very, very happy with my children and their way of life and their responsibilities in the church. At the present, I have 2 boys that are bishops, 2 sons-in-law that are branch presidents or have been branch presidents, and all practically all of them with marriages that are very pleasing to me and to themselves. We're thankful for all these blessings and come about through living the principles laid down by our Heavenly Father. I shouldn't say laid down, but given the opportunity of living these principles that have been presented to us here and through the faith that we enjoy. And so we continue on here. Jesse has passed away now about 6.5 years ago, and I'm enjoying life with my second companion and very finding it a very enjoyable time, and look forward to more years. And I think that's about all I have to say today. Oh dear.